Hello, I'm here with Caitlin to talk about Amazon satellites. But first, I've got some griping I've heard a lot of people talking about. There's false information about the war in the Gaza Strip proliferating like crazy, and Elon Musk personally recommended two accounts notorious for promoting lies and anti-Semitic content. So he continues his becoming red-pilled on the alt-right, just doing every rotten thing that the alt-right people do. Researchers have studied Twitter to watch its descent into disinformation and Nazi treatments, and they found it's got much less reliable since Musk took control. He got rid of the verified check marks. He stopped labeling accounts as government affiliated and began labeling mainstream non-government affiliated accounts as government affiliated in order to defame them, which is why I think NPR left, because they were tired of being called a government organization. And he began sending money to accounts that draw heavy engagement regarding views instead of accuracy, which is a polite way to say he gives money to alt-right lunatics, bomb throwers. So anyway, that's in case anybody wonders if Twitter's getting better. No, it's not getting better. Anyway, let's go on to Caitlin that has satellites. And you're on mute.
I knew that. I was testing if you knew that I was on mute.
Well, I did. I passed.
Very good. So before we start talking about satellites, I'll talk about my background because that's always something fun to talk about. So this is the Andromeda Galaxy taken in the visible spectrum. Now, the Andromeda Galaxy is very large. It is the dominant galaxy in our local group, our local cluster. In fact, the Milky Way is heading towards it and will collide with it in billions of years.
It's bigger than the full moon in the sky, right?
Yes, the angular size of the Andromeda Galaxy is bigger than the entire full moon. So you need a very low focal length or low zoom telescope to be able to capture the whole thing. And I did my best. I rotated my camera so it would come in, as wide frame as I could. And yeah, it's a pancake flat galaxy. You can see the bands of dust in it. There's not a whole lot to say about it, but it's big and it's massive, and it's right there in the night sky. You cannot see it with the unaided eye, but if you do have a telescope, sometimes you can see a little smudge of light that is the center core there, you see. And of course, with better telescopes, you can see the dust around it and everything. So, but yeah, Messier, who found Andromeda and documented it, had no idea what it was. This looked like a smudge.
How long did it take you to get that picture?
That was about a night's worth of exposures.
That's very good.
All right, so on to our first article here, which is from Semaphore. Let me pull that up if I can learn how to use a computer. Here we go. Okay, perfect. So Semaphore has this article talking about Amazon and Starlink. What's this all about? What is Starlink? What is Amazon? What's going on? So Diego Mendoza wrote this article talking about how Amazon put up this satellite network called Starlink, which of course I know nothing about. This is all news to me, of course.
Amazon didn't put up Starlink, did they?
What?
It wasn't Amazon that put up Starlink.
Sorry, no. Kuiper.
That's SpaceX. Yeah.
I don't know anything about this stuff, obviously.
Yeah.
So sorry about that. It's so just so people know, it is. I just woke up.
Mm-hmm.
It's anyway. So Amazon put up. The article says Amazon takes on Starlink. Yeah, no. Amazon put up Kuiper, which is the first two satellites in their network. So they put up like two small proto satellites to test the network, and it went up on an Atlas V rocket, and it's going good so far. All articles seem to suggest that everything is going as planned, although I cannot comment. Although I would assume you should trust the articles. And let's see. So the article talks about, of course, Amazon's great space ambitions of competing with Starlink and having internet access through the Kuiper network, which will be slightly more advanced than Starlink's, which will be fantastic. However, scientists are worried about how all these satellites, these mesh network satellites, are going to affect astronomical studies. However, as you saw in the picture I showed, I'm actually able to remove satellite tracks. And this is done, and I'll switch away from the article here. I'll explain how this is done. So the way I get an image like what you're seeing is I take exposure after exposure after exposure. So in this case, I took 5-minute exposures, one after the other. Some of them have satellite trails, some of them don't. Now, you stack, it's called stacking. You stack all the images together. And so you in turn have a image that would have taken like 6 or 7 hours to actually take. Now, the way the stacking process works is it works on a distribution model, probability model. So so every time, how do I explain it? So the camera has a sensor that detects photons, right? That's essentially all it does. Every time light hits the sensor, a photon activates an electron to go into the electron well. Well, what the software can do is it can say, okay, over a 5-minute period, this pixel got, 100 photons. And then, the next frame, oh, this got 70, it got 75, and then it got, 120, so on and so forth. Then it creates a Poisson, distribution. And if you have a satellite track going through the image, because it has that statistical distribution, it can say, oh, whoa, this is a big outlier. Now we have 1,000. No, we can just ignore that. So this is sort of a Kappa Sigma type, averaging where you ignore the outliers. And that way you can just get rid of the satellite tracks through your astronomical images already. So I do understand astronomers' concerns, but techniques are already being developed and have been developed to, not ruin every image that astronomers are trying to do. And more techniques are going to be developed.
Well, and that system would also remove all the UFOs that you're supposed to be covering up. So that would be great.
Exactly. So we get to cover up the UFOs and the satellite trails all in one go. So perfect.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's also a few other concerns that people have. Greenhouse emissions. So satellite internet does create a significant amount of greenhouse emissions compared to land internet, and that is something that we'll just have to address through future technology and better rocket designs, I suppose.
Just from launching the rocket, right?
I believe so. Yep.
Well, all right. I guess that's true. We just need to come up with electric rockets.
We need electric. Well, I don't know. I mean, the thing is that a lot of these rockets, I mean, if you look at something like the SLS, that's just a liquid oxygen and hydrogen rocket. I mean, all that's doing is spewing out water.
Mm-hmm.
It's powerful, but it's just spewing out water. But a lot of them are not hydrogen and oxygen. So you have like kerosene-based rockets that are just stinking up the atmosphere. So I don't know what the solution is. I mean, you might say like, yeah, let's all switch to liquid hydrogen and oxygen. The problem is those are very hard to light. And one of the newest technologies, of course, is getting those boosters to land by themselves. So unless we can solve this sort of fundamental problem, I don't know how that's going to work. So,
yeah. All right. Well, there's a Risky Biz report, which I thought was very nice, summarizing a digital defense report talking about ransomware and the way it's been growing. And their big thing was that human operated ransomware has more than doubled over the past year, which didn't surprise me that much. But they say where people actually interact with the customer directly, or well, not customer, the victim. But the part I thought was interesting was of the 78% of IoT devices with known vulnerabilities, 46% cannot be patched. And attacks targeting open source software have grown by over 700% since 2019. And I've certainly heard about this. I remember just a few years ago, Linux and open source seemed like they almost never got attacked. And you didn't really have to worry about it. It was mostly commercial stuff like Adobe and Microsoft that got attacked. And that's emphatically not true now. Now I'm hearing a lot about open source software attacks, Linux getting attacked, and bootloaders getting attacked. So all the things that just a few years ago sounded so exotic that you didn't have to worry about them are now real threats, and you have to worry about them. And the ransomware just keeps growing and growing. And I recently heard a ransomware expert on Pulse Security Weekly said, there's nothing we can do. It's going to keep growing. There's nothing you can do to stop it, which seems to be true because he said may always get in through a security 101 flaw like a default password or known vulnerable process. And now they say mostly as soon as they get in your network, they deploy ransomware within 1 day. So it's almost superhuman to imagine that you would have an intelligence, an incident response team that can actually respond that quickly to an intrusion. And that's what you need. So cheerful news, job security for all of us. Anyway, let's talk about RISC-V.
Yeah, let's talk about RISC-V. So RISC-V, I've mentioned on the podcast, is something that I truly like. And I have a whole bunch of RISC-V computers. I just have this collection of RISC-V because I just love RISC-V. They all suck. All the computers I have suck, but I love RISC-V. I love the concept of it. The software is getting better. So I will say that it's taking a while for like distributions like Debian to get their RISC-V distributions working correctly and all the software debugged and everything to work on RISC-V. And it's getting to the point where it like kind of works.
Debian is usually the first one to jump on new hardware. If Debian isn't even done it, I suppose nobody else has.
I mean, you can run Debian on RISC-V.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's Debian, and then there's things like Chromium, right?
Right.
Which does not, like, I had some audio issues with the Chromium browser on my latest RISC-V board. I mean, it's just lots of bugs that just from various software vendors that need to be fixed. So, but like I said, I do love RISC-V. I like the idea of an open source CPU architecture, right? Instead of using a proprietary architecture that is controlled by one company, having these open standards always benefits consumers in the end. Now, unfortunately, these open standards are upsetting a few politicians. So let's move over to the article. If I can figure out how computers work. Here we go. So IT News has an article by Stephen Nellis and Max A. Cherney. And essentially what's going on, so I'm still trying to figure out what the big problem is, but China is using open source technology, obviously, RISC-V, to generate RISC-V processors. Now, it's not a huge market, but I imagine it's going to grow, especially in IoT devices where you have things like routers and you want to make the CPU as cheap as possible. And in order to do that, you don't want to pay licensings or royalties to like the ARM Corporation. Now, the problem is that China is, of course, taking open source technology that's developed in the United States and in the West in general, and using it to boost their semiconductor industry without, I don't know if they're actually doing a whole lot to add to the open source project. They're just manufacturing the chips essentially, which, I mean, in a fair economy, I would assume that's fine. I mean, it's open source. Everyone's allowed to use it if they want. I mean, I don't contribute to every open source project that I use. But unfortunately, it does get in the way of the United States' desire to curb China's influence in the semiconductor industry. So the United States has put sanctions on China, trying to move a lot more manufacturing back to the United States and keep a lot of our technology proprietary into ourselves. But of course, RISC-V throws a huge wrench into that. And I don't know what the solution would be. I guess RISC-V for everyone in the United States will just have to deal with it. I mean, maybe if you're a government agency, you can say, oh, we have to use Intel architecture because it's designed and manufactured in the United States and we can trust it. So that'll delay the adoption of RISC-V even further. But
I think something similar happened with Wi-Fi, right? Wi-Fi version 5 or 6 was only available in China, and so America delayed its rollout because they didn't want to use Chinese stuff. I think something like that happened.
It was like a cell network too, or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it was like one of the cellular protocols.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it seems to me like lawmakers are just now discovering open source software and open source hardware and are just like, wait, that's a thing?
Well, I think lawmakers are very, very paranoid and focused on battle with China, and they're sort of horrified to discover that a bunch of things are going on that are kind of outside government control. And I think open source software, like blockchain, really, really offends them because they can't really say where it is and they can't really stop it from moving across boundaries.
I will say I did get that impression when working with the federal government, where they sort of treated open source software the same way as commercial software, which I mean works in theory but not in practice, because in commercial software you can say I need an attestation of everyone who worked on it, which countries, etc. But open source software is of course just all over the place. No one knows who worked on it. It could have been a KGB spy as well as the United States top engineers. It's everyone gets to work on it, and a lot of our infrastructure absolutely relies on it. And I saw this firsthand of politicians and leadership realizing that we're building all this infrastructure on like volunteers from like the KGB. Wait a second.
Yeah. And I think as we move into the supply chain security and the software bill of materials, it's just becoming more and more obvious that we're in trouble. There was another thing I saw recently on Paul's podcast where they said something like 90% of projects have known vulnerable versions of libraries in them, and they don't know it because there isn't an easy way to scan for that.
Mm-hmm.
And so on. I mean, it's just this whole ecosystem where you just arbitrarily apt-get something and then you arbitrarily add an npm or a Python module to whatever you're doing without really knowing who wrote it or which version it is or anything is actually very sloppy and dangerous. And there's a huge pressure towards coming up with some better organized system.
Yeah. So, and one of the things that's frustrating is that you have systems like pip on Python,
Right.
which handles, packages, but a lot of the times you'll use pip to install a like command line tool. And there's no super easy way to upgrade your Python pip libraries and tools to the latest version. Now, there are some things to make it a little easier. There is one called like pip something, but it's not like built into pip. You have to like go through, freeze everything, and upgrade. And then even if you do use the tool, I ran into some bugs, trying to get everything to the latest version. And it's frustrating. So yeah, especially with npm and pip and everything, they weren't really thinking about that. They wanted, I get where they were coming from, right? You have an API and it's open source, so that API is going to be constantly changing. If you have a program written on API 2.1, you don't want the users downloading 3.0. You want a copy of 2.1, but of course 2.1 has all the bugs of 2.1 that were fixed in 3.0. And so you have to balance the two, and a lot of these open source projects didn't really think about balancing it, like saying, oh, you this is outdated, you got to contact the maintenance person for this project to update to the latest version of this library. But they don't do that. They just say, nope, you want 2.0, fine, you get 2.0.
Well, I don't really blame them. And this is why we moved to containers, because every time you change a version of something, it breaks things. You have to go
Yep.
through your code and find all the bugs.
Yep.
And so that's a whole lot of extra development work for no apparent value in the end result. That's why I'm thinking commercial software already goes through serious compliance and QA testing, and they're going to have to add to that a test that tests for what versions of libraries you're doing. But then you got rot. Within 6 months, your deployed product is now using out-of-date libraries, and you can't change it without like a new version. So this really seems like an almost unsolvable problem.
It is unsolvable unless we change the way that we develop software. So especially if you're a library author, you need to plan your API ahead of time and add, like, I know like Microsoft is good about this, where they have like reserved parameters for future use. And you just sort of have to think that way. Like, you have an API and then you have like reserved parameters. And then when you start up the library, you say, I'm using 2.0. So if there is some like versioning differences in the behavior of like 2.0 and 3.0, the software will know to use the 2.0 behavior instead. I mean, you just sort of have to think ahead, but that's not the way that most software is developed, especially open source. It's just sort of, I want this, I want that, which I get. I do the same thing, but that's the only way to solve this issue.
Okay, well, it sounds good. And I know no software works basically by tradition. There's a whole generation of customs of how you do things, and it gradually changes to new things, which is why the old stuff is always so dreadfully insecure, because there just used to be bad traditions like putting in a secret backdoor hard-coded account and stuff like that.
Right. Using lots of if statements, nested if statements and stuff like that. Yep.
Yep, and GoTo.
And GoTo, yep.
I used to use GoTo all the time back in the 70s. Anyway,
I used to have such bad nested if statements. I would just be like, if this, then if this, and then if this, and then if this.
I learned assembler. I learned 8-bit assembler, and I wrote self-modifying code because the 8-bit assembly library didn't really have very many of the assembly code instructions. So I would just have a hard-coded move, and I would fill in the address by calculating it. And I thought this was awesome. This makes my code faster and smaller. And it was like 20 years later, people looked at it and said, you can't do that. I said, why not? It works. They said, that's terrible. That's a virus. That's a horrible practice. And I said, gee, I know. I thought it was brilliant.
It is brilliant if you're working on an 8-bit microprocessor with very limited CPU power, and every cycle is important. Having self-modifying code is a critical skill to be able to develop.
I had a 6502 running at 1/2 of 1 megahertz.
Exactly.
And it was the cat's meow at the time. But, I wasn't even thinking about things. They said, you can't even print out the code and read it if you do that. And nobody could possibly update or anything. I said, well, yeah, I wasn't thinking about that.
Right.
Anyway, so Amnesty International has a report about the Predator software, which I thought was very interesting. They really do great work. And one thing I thought was so they have, as usual, this commercial spyware, which uses iOS 0 days. So it punches right through and takes over your phone and finds everything on it. And it's deployed primarily against journalists, mainly against human rights journalists. And they have been tracking a guy called Joseph Gordon on Twitter, who would reply to famous people with links which look good, but they're links that lead to the Predator malware right in the public where they can see it. They should normally try to keep this stuff private so they don't get caught. So these guys did it many times in public. And they have interesting lists of the validation installation process where they check to make sure who not to put it on. And one first thing is it checks location. And if you are an American or an Israeli phone, it will not install the malware. And so that makes me wonder if this is really an American operation. But the rest of the article makes it sound like it's not an American operation. It sounds like a Chinese operation targeting people in Taiwan. It is surprising they did not want to affect Americans or Israelis, though. That part confuses me, but it's very interesting to see what it did. It checks running processes to make sure you're not running more than one process out of the temp folder when you should be running 0, because that presumably indicates previous infection by the same malware. It checks to see if you're monitoring the logs, and if you are, it won't install. And I would sure like to know more about that. How does it tell if you're monitoring logs? It checks your location. It checks if you're in developer mode, if your phone is jailbreaked. It checks to see if you are running monitoring processes like TCP dump or netstat or Frida, all the stuff I run all the time on emulators to analyze misbehavior of apps. It checks to see if you're running a proxy or if you have a root certificate installed that lets you run a man in the middle. And if any of that is happening, it won't run. So I'm interested to see this. I have heard from people that you cannot do Android malware analysis on an Android emulator. And you have to have a real phone. And I know iOS always uses a real phone anyway for testing. So anyway, I thought it was very interesting to see. It's weird. They don't say what nation is doing this, and I can't really figure it out from the clues. But the technical part I understand, which is very interesting. The political part, I would like somebody else to read this and have more informed opinions about who's doing this and why are they doing it, because it seems to have weird contradictory clues. Yeah.
I bet the US-Israeli block has something to do with the fact that they know that the best blue teamers, the best hackers, are in Israel and the United States. And if someone's going to find that malware and reverse engineer it, they're going to be probably in Israel or the United States.
That's what I wondered. Maybe they just don't care about Israel and the United States because they're targeting Taiwan, and therefore hitting people in America would just like blow their cover and get them in trouble for no reason.
Yeah, you do. I know at CCDC, when I'm going after the blue team, I do so many silly, ridiculous things that make no sense, except for the fact that I know the students are looking for me.
Yeah.
And it changes the way that you do red teaming. When you know you have that active engagement from the blue team, you have to take all these extra steps. Like, for example, if I were doing like a real ransomware, not that I would, or if I were on like an engagement, I would just SSH into a system once I got the creds and start fooling around. You can't do that at CCDC because the students will see you log in. So what I have to do instead is I have this technique where you can run the SSH, have it.
Wait, your like sound vanished.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah. What you do is you can have SSH run a single command and disconnect, and the students have a very difficult time doing that. Figuring out what's going on when you do that. They don't see you log on. It's so quick. It's just on, you're connected and disconnected.
Yeah.
Now, stuff like that, you just change your tactics based on what you think the blue team is doing and how they're probably detecting you.
Yeah.
And you do silly things like that, like not having your checking to see what's running on the system first before running. Not wanting it to run on certain systems, the students are going to be looking at. And in fact, normally in engagements, you use reverse shells. That's not necessarily because, the students are looking for reverse shells.
Mhm.
It actually makes more sense in that case to use a bind shell.
Yeah. That makes sense. That timing issue reminds me. I did the DEF CON CTF qual maybe 12 years ago, and they had a Twitter clone, and you would connect, and then it would hang up on me. And I was using a portable laptop at coffee houses, and I would, hey, damn, the Wi-Fi is no good, and go to a different coffee house and a different coffee house for hours before I finally figured out it was programmed to hang up on you after 0.1 second. All you could do was script everything. So it would connect and do whatever you want, and then it would hang up on you. It wasn't me. It was the design.
Exactly. If you know what
that way.
Exactly. So if when you know when you predict what the users are doing, you do some really silly, design patterns that don't seem to make a whole lot of sense until you start realizing, okay, you're trying to avoid getting caught.
Yeah, yeah. Well, let's go back to you with information about Kroger.
Yeah. So worst case scenario is happening with AI, apparently. Let me pull up the article here. So this is an article on The Street by David Klein. And Kroger, which is a grocery store chain in the United States, wants to use AI at the self-checkout, not to help customers, do things easier or anything like that, but to act as a security system. Apparently, theft has gone up due to self-checkouts, and this is due to a few different things. So there are, of course, people that are just like, hey, self-checkout, I'm just going to steal stuff, whatever. But there's also people that just mistakenly forget to ring stuff up. You get what you pay for. If you're not paying for checkout people, you're just going to get people that make mistakes. So not all these thefts are intentional or anything, but they have noticed an increase in theft or stock loss, whatever they want to call it. And so they want to add like basically AI security to the self-checkout. And Walmart and Target are doing the same thing. And now we're just going to have like this AI automated security everywhere, because if this works, everyone's going to employ it everywhere. And you're not going to be watched by like a human being, but there's going to be some AI watching you in every store you go into. And stores are private businesses. You can't be like, you can't do that. No, if they want to record you, they can, and they're all going to do it. So you don't have a choice.
I've seen this in movies and also in China, where they have this flying drone that flies over you and says, hey, stop what you're doing. Don't litter or something.
Exactly. It's this. Yeah. I mean, this is a complete misuse of AI. I mean, I understand why they're doing it, but no, this is just, I don't want to live in this kind of society.
I think it'll be pretty hilarious. But of course, it means a bunch of people will get falsely flagged for having stolen stuff when they didn't.
Exactly.
And it'll probably turn out to be racially biased and stuff like that, like every other AI camera system.
Exactly. There's going to be huge bugs, huge biases built into the data set. creating, racism and sexism and all this stuff. And then there'll be fun ways to trick it. I'm sure you can camouflage your at your checkout,
Yeah.
make it look like make a gold watch look like a Twizzler. Be like, oh, sorry, I forgot the Twizzler. AI says that'll be 20, $1.50. Like, okay, thank you. It's fun stuff that you could do with AI, but it's
The self-checkout is a very strange technology. Many studies I've read have said it doesn't mean they can have less employees. It doesn't actually save them money. Customers don't actually like it. It's very strange that everybody is doing it when most people don't want it. Although I listened to a tech podcast and there was one person there, just like me, it said, I will always prefer to use the self-checkout. I'd rather talk to a computer than a person. And I'm that guy. I'd rather go through the automated checkout. But most people don't want it. And apparently it doesn't save them money. So it's very unclear why it became such a trend.
I like it when there's huge lines at the registers. Now you have like 6 more registers that people can ring up themselves. Like, I want to get my stuff and get out as fast as possible. And anything that helps me do that, I'm in favor of. I don't care if I'm talking to a person or not, but whatever.
Yeah. Well, anyway, like I was talking about this story actually a couple of weeks ago, and the thing I thought is you better train your staff to be really polite when they come up to someone and says, the AI says you're stealing stuff. I need to check your receipt. You better be really polite about that because it's likely to be wrong.
So one thing I learned a while ago is that store employees have no right to view your receipts. So if I were to, so like when I would go to like Kmart and stuff,
in the store,
while you're in the store,
they seems like they would have the right to take all your packages back if you're in the store. I mean,
no, and in fact, you're getting into even more ridiculous territory. But if you have a receipt, like you check out, you have your receipt, put everything in your bag.
Yeah,
they can ask to see your receipt. And I don't know if this applies to Costco because it's a membership place, but at places like Kmart and stuff, absolutely. Like they can be like, they'll ask you, can I see your receipt? And you can just tell them, no, thank you.
Well, then they should be allowed to not let you leave with the bags if you refuse to show your receipt.
No, they can't keep you there.
What law? You don't have the right to like take stuff out without satisfying the owners of it that you deserve.
No, you pay at the cashier, right?
Well, but there's clearly an issue. Did you really pay? And that seems like it's within their rights to say you can't take that stuff out of here until you make sure you really paid.
No, well, okay. So there's 2 things here. Like, let's say, so this was a blanket thing at Kmart where every time you would leave, they'd ask to see your receipt,
like Costco does.
You like Costco, and you can outright refuse. There's nothing they can do about it. And I mean, be polite about it. I mean, these people are just doing their jobs. Don't be rude. But it's annoying. I don't like showing my receipts. I know I got what I got. I only bought like 1 or 2 things. I know there's no mistake. I don't. It's like, no. You can say no. But if you do steal something, like they think you've stolen, and there are some brazen people stealing stuff. I mean, you can tell they break through stuff. The people at the store cannot like do anything to like keep you from leaving.
Yeah,
even the guards, just liability reasons.
Right, observe and report. Yeah, because the violence would be more of a disaster than stealing the stuff.
Exactly.
Why stealing is just rampant. And that's why I think they're trying to come up with these non-violent ways to, that's what they said in the article I read. They said that the main target here is the organized gangs that show up and steal just piles of stuff. And hopefully this AI forcing you to go through self-checkout system would somehow limit that.
Yeah, and that is one of the big loopholes that a lot of gangs keep, because I mean, if you're talking about like a homeless person who's stealing, a cup of noodles and like a candy bar or whatever, who cares? Homeless person, go for it.
Well, no, in San Francisco, they steal like bags of stuff and then they go sell it at the BART station on the ground. So it's just a private business,
Exactly. I mean, that stuff you don't that you shouldn't tolerate. But as far as just people stealing because they're hungry and poor or whatever, and I don't even care if they steal junk food. I mean, people get hungry and get cravings for junk food. Fine. steal some junk food. I don't care. Don't create a police state around it. But when you start getting like organized crime involved, and you start having these large organizations where they boost a bunch of the merchandise, where they're taking hundreds and hundreds of dollars to resell on the street, not even use themselves. Like, if a mother wanted to steal because she couldn't afford it, hundreds of dollars worth of diapers so that her baby could have diapers, I'd be like, okay, let's look the other way. Like I'm, but when you start getting organized crime involved, it really becomes a big problem, and it's never stopping. So you need to find a good balance where you're not like coming down hard with the hammer on like everyone that like steals something from your store, potentially creating a violent situation, putting people at risk. At the same time, you do need to deter the organized crime, that's boosting large, pallets of merchandise. So,
well, the obvious solution is roving AI drones with death rays, zapping people they disapprove of. That will create an orderly society, and we'll all be grateful.
Or just have RoboCop, like real life RoboCop. Take some dead cop, throw his dead carcass into a like robotic suit, have him walk around town, start shooting bad guys. Perfect.
There you go. Simple solution.
Yeah, simple.
All right. Well, we've solved all the world's problems. So that's it. There'll be another one of these on Friday.